It was the kind of morning that made Kensington Palace feel almost ordinary. Almost. The light came in soft through the tall windows, pale and golden, the way English autumn light tends to be, like it's apologizing for not being warmer. The corridors were quiet except for the sound of small feet, running where small feet were not supposed to run, and the low, patient voice of a mother telling them, for the third time, to please slow down. Catherine, Princess of Wales, and was trying to get 3 children ready for a formal engagement. Anyone who has tried to dress a single child for a formal occasion understands the particular chaos of that task. 3 children, one of whom had already lost a shoe, one of whom was refusing to wear the jacket. That had been selected, and one who had gone very quiet, in a way that experienced parents recognize as deeply suspicious. That was the morning Kate was having, and she moved through it the way she always moved through difficult things. Steadily. Plus without theater. With the kind of calm that does not come from an absence of stress, but from years of learning how to hold stress without letting it hold you back. The engagement that day was a reception at the palace, not a state dinner, not a foreign tour, not one of the enormous public-facing events that fill the royal calendar with crowds and cameras and carefully rehearsed choreography. Well, and this was smaller. A curated gathering of guests who had been selected for their work in early childhood education, family welfare, and maternal health, causes that Catherine had woven into the fabric of her public work for over a decade. These were her people, in a sense, the academics, the practitioners, the advocates, the people who thought seriously about the same things she had spent years thinking seriously about. The children were not supposed to be present for most of it. That had been, I guess, the plan. Royal children attend things carefully in controlled windows, and then they're taken elsewhere by people whose entire professional life is devoted to managing the logistics of royal childhood with grace and discretion. But plans, as any parent knows, are the things that exist right up until the moment a child decides they don't. George had behaved impeccably, as he generally did, with the natural gravity of a boy who has somehow always understood, even without being told in so many words, the weight of what he's being prepared for. He stood beside his mother with his hands loose at his sides, his back straight, and he greeted people with a seriousness that made adults smile in spite of themselves. Charlotte had been Charlotte. Bright, curious, already forming opinions about the guests with the frank assessment of a child who has inherited something sharp from both sides of her family. So Louis had been escorted gently but firmly away from the formal portion of proceedings after it became clear that his interest in the flower arrangement on the central table was not decorative, but structural, and that if given another 30 seconds, he was going to find out, empirically, whether it could be disassembled. That was not a disaster. That was a Tuesday. The room settled into the comfortable rhythm of these kinds of events. People spoke in clusters. Staff moved through the space with practiced invisibility, offering things, removing things, making the whole mechanism of hospitality function so smoothly it appeared not to be functioning at all. Catherine moved, I guess, through the room the way she had learned to do at hundreds of these events, fully present in each conversation, remembering names, connecting what one person had told her to something another person had mentioned. I'm making everyone feel briefly that they were the most interesting person in the room because, for those few minutes, they genuinely were. And then there was the woman. She had been invited through a professional connection, an academic whose work on childhood development had been cited in briefings, whose credentials were solid, whose name had appeared on the right papers in the right journals. On paper, she, for what it's worth, belonged in the room. She was in her 60s, carrying herself with the particular confidence of a person who has spent decades being the expert in every space she entered, accustomed to rooms where her opinion set the temperature. She watched Catherine with the children with an expression she didn't bother to conceal. It moved through several stages: assessment, consideration, judgment, and landed somewhere that looked like disapproval, though it hadn't yet found its words. It found them approximately 40 minutes into the reception, so at a moment when Charlotte, who had been hovering near the edge of the adult conversation with the restless energy of a child who is trying very hard to be good and is running low on reserves, leaned against her mother's arm and whispered something. Kate bent down. She always bent down. Not the slight incline that some adults perform when addressing children, the polite bow. That maintains distance, but a full, committed crouch that brought her face level with Charlotte's. She listened to be fair, whatever was being said. She answered it. She smoothed Charlotte's hair once with the flat of her palm and said something that made the child straighten up and take a breath and return to the effort of being patient. It was a tiny moment. It lasted maybe 20 seconds. The woman saw it and chose it. She waited until Catherine had straightened, and the conversation around them had resumed its normal texture, and then she said, not loudly, but not quietly either, I'm in the tone of someone delivering a professional observation, that she hoped the princess didn't find it exhausting, being so hands-on with the children during formal engagements. She said it with a slight tilt to the words that meant something more than what the words said. The kind of comment that carries its real payload in the subtext, dressed in the polite clothes of concern. There was a half-beat of silence in the small radius of people who had heard it. It is a TBH, particular kind of audacity, what the woman had done. Not a shout. I guess, not an obvious attack. The kind of comment that is engineered to be difficult to respond to directly. Because any direct response requires naming what it actually is, and naming it feels like escalation. The comment is designed to land, and then sit there, passive, wearing the expression of innocent inquiry. Catherine heard it. Her expression didn't change in any way that the untrained eye would have caught. There was perhaps a fraction of a second, a stillness, and then she smiled, the specific smile that is warm without being agreeable, and she said that she didn't find it exhausting at all, that she found it the most straightforward part of the day. The woman was not satisfied with this. Satisfaction was not what she had come for. She continued. She had research, she said, and the way she said it, and the word landed like a credential being placed on a table. She had research suggesting that children performed better in formal or semi-formal social settings, when parents maintained clear physical and emotional distance. That the instinct to comfort and respond at close range, while understandable from an attachment perspective, could inhibit the development of independent self-regulation in children who were going to be required to function in high-pressure public environments. She phrased to be fair, it carefully, academically, with the structure of a woman who had given lectures. She was not, she said, speaking critically. She was simply, as someone with a professional interest in the subject, making an observation. The room had gone very slightly quieter than it had been. There were people in that room who studied early childhood development for a living, who had written the papers, who TBH, I would spend careers in the field that this woman was now deploying as a weapon dressed up as expertise. They were listening. Some of them had the particular stillness of people choosing not to speak yet. Kate looked at the woman for a moment. Just a moment. And in that moment, something shifted in the room. Nothing visible, nothing that could be pointed to afterward and described precisely, but the kind of shift you feel in the air before weather. She didn't raise her voice. Plus, she didn't perform anger. She didn't reach for the arsenal of status that she could have reached for and chose every single day not to reach for. She simply began to speak, quietly and with absolute precision. And what came out of her mouth was not a deflection. It was not a capitulation, and it was not the careful diplomatic non-answer that people in her position are trained to offer in uncomfortable moments. What came out was knowledge. She cited research. She cited specific studies on named researchers, gave time frames, described methodology. She spoke about the evidence base for responsive parenting in children under significant social pressure. Children, she noted, who face unusual and specific demands on their composure from an extremely early age. She talked about what the data actually showed regarding secure attachment and a child's capacity to regulate in high-pressure environments, that the research didn't, in fact, suggest what the woman had implied it suggested, and that the most current work in the field leaned rather firmly in a different direction. I mean, she was calm. She was specific. Plus, she was, by any measure, better prepared for this conversation than the woman who had started it. The woman blinked. It was a small blink, but the room noticed it. There's a version of this moment that people imagine when they imagine a princess responding to an insult. Something dramatic, something sharp, to a cutting remark delivered from a height with the full weight of institution and title behind it. That isn't what happened. What happened was something considerably less comfortable for the woman who had made the comment, because it could not be dismissed as defensiveness or royal hauteur or the wounded pride of a mother who had been poked. What it could not be dismissed as was ignorance. And the woman was standing in a room full of the woman's own professional peers, people who had watched Kate move through a decade of public work in their field with what they had come, over time, to understand was not performance, who had sat in briefings with her and been surprised, who had expected the ceremonial function and found instead someone who had done the reading. Charlotte drifted back to her mother's side at some point during this exchange. She stood pretty much there, half listening with the selective attention of a child, leaning slightly against Kate's leg without making a production of it. Kate's hand found the top of her head for just a second, automatic, not even a conscious gesture, the way you reach for something that is simply always there. The woman watched this and said nothing. Plus, across the room, standing in the particular stillness of a man whose job is to stand still in rooms and understand everything that is happening in them, saw one of the royal protection officers had been watching the whole exchange with the flat, patient attention that is the professional signature of his role. He hadn't moved. Plus, he would not move unless he needed to. Nothing here required him to move. But his eyes hadn't left the woman since she opened her mouth. That too was noticed by the people close enough to see it. Not look, what he didn't thing, but what his stillness communicated. The quality of it. The fact that a man trained to read rooms and protect the people in them had locked onto this particular interaction and hadn't looked away. There's a message in that even when nothing is said. The reception continued. It had to. These things always continue. Plus, staff refilled glasses and conversations resumed, and the room found its way back to its regular temperature, the way rooms do, because the social contract of gatherings like these requires it. The woman moved to a different part of the room. She spoke to other people. She was pleasant about it. To be fair, but something had changed. The people who basically had been standing close enough to hear, it carried the exchange with them through the rest of the afternoon. They talked about it afterward, in the way that people talk about things they have witnessed that surprised them. Not with scandal, exactly. With the particular energy of having seen something they hadn't expected to see, something that had confirmed or revised or simply deepened something they thought they understood. What they had seen was a woman who was told, in a room full of her professional audience, that she didn't know what she was doing with her own children, and who had answered that comment not with rank, not with hurt, not with the full institutional weight of what she was and what she represented, but with the specific, earned, the detailed knowledge of someone who had spent years understanding exactly what she was doing and exactly why. The woman who had made the comment had expected perhaps a flustered princess, a polite deflection, a gracious change of subject. She hadn't expected to lose an argument in her own field in front of her own colleagues in a room she had expected to be impressive in. She hadn't expected either the quiet presence of the man by the wall who had watched the whole thing without blinking, who hadn't needed to do anything at all, who had simply been there, still and certain, in the way that a certain kind of protection requires nothing more than the certainty of its presence to do its work. The palace had its own way of answering things, not always loudly, not always visibly, but always. The reception ended the way those events always end, not with a clear moment of conclusion, but with a gradual thinning, guests finding the polite architecture of departure, handshakes and thank yous, and the careful exchange of cards and promises to follow up on things that had been discussed. The room gave itself back slowly, piece by piece, until it was just staff and the soft mechanical work of closing things down. Catherine had stood at the door for the last 20 minutes of it. This was not protocol. It was her. She honestly had a way of closing events like this that felt less like an official farewell and more like a genuine one, looking each person in the face as they left, remembering the thread of whatever they had spoken about and pulling it one last time, so that what people walked away with was the sensation of having been actually spoken to and not merely attended to. It was a skill, and also something more than a skill. You can't entirely perform warmth at that resolution for that many years without some of it being true. The woman was one of the last to leave. She had spent the second half of the reception in the further reaches of the room, occupying herself with other conversations, performing. Ease with the practiced fluency of someone who has spent a career operating in rooms where their self-possession was essential to their standing. And she was good at it. You didn't get to where she had gotten by being bad at it. But there was something beneath the performance, a recalibration happening, a quiet and invisible process of adjusting the picture she had arrived with to fit the one she had been given. When she reached the door, and Catherine, she stopped. The pause was brief, but it was real. And then she said, with something that was neither quite an apology, nor quite not one, that she had found the discussion very interesting, that she hadn't, perhaps, expected to be challenged on certain points, that the princess had clearly given these questions a great deal of thought. It was the closest, given who she was and where she was, that she was likely to get to saying she had been wrong. Kate received it the same way she received everything in these rooms, without triumph, without magnanimity performed for an audience, without making anything more of it than it was. She said that she had found the conversation valuable, and that she hoped the work the woman was doing would continue to find the platform it deserved. She said it without irony. She meant it. The work was real even when the person wielding it had been careless with it, and Kate had long understood that those two things could be true simultaneously, and that allowing them to be was not weakness, but precision. The woman left. The door closed. In the car on the way back, through the parts of the palace grounds that aren't photographed, not displayed, not rendered into the public image of royal life, Kate sat with Charlotte, who had fallen asleep against her arm in the loose, absolute way that children fall asleep. The kind of sleep that is a full surrender, a small weight simply deciding it is done. George was reading. Louis had been asleep for several minutes before the car even started moving, having deployed, and somewhere in the preceding hour, whatever reserves of good behavior he had arrived with. Kate looked out the window. She was kind of thinking, though anyone watching from outside would have seen only stillness and the reflection, of London moving past the glass. She, in my opinion, was thinking about the woman's comment, not with the heat of the moment behind it, but with the cooler examination that follows heat, turning it over, for looking at it from the angle that asks not what's wrong with the person who said it, but what the saying of it reveals about the larger thing. She had spent years inside that larger thing. The examination of her parenting, the close, sometimes hostile, sometimes well-intentioned scrutiny of every visible choice she made about her children, was one of the conditions of her life that she had never been able to fully prepare for, because there's no preparation for what it actually feels like to have the way you love your children treated as a subject for public debate. You know it is coming. Plus, you understand, intellectually, before you ever become a parent in that position, that it will happen. And then it happens, and the knowing does not, it turns out, do very much to blunt it. What look had made today different, and she knew it had been different, for she had felt it while it was happening, was the location of the challenge, not a tabloid, not an anonymous comment in the architecture of the internet, not even a well-meaning piece in a magazine about the royal family's approach to childhood in the modern age. It had been a professional, in her professional context, using her professional credential as the weapon, in a room full of her professional colleagues. That specificity mattered. It, to be fair, had been designed, whether consciously or not, to land in the place that would be hardest to deflect, not on her appearance, not on her choices as a princess, on her competence as a mother, framed in the language that was supposed to belong to the experts and not to her. The implicit message had been, you're the subject of this field, not a participant in it. You are the raw material. We study the data, not the scholar. She understood why the woman had thought that, when she had spent enough years in rooms where that assumption was present, hovering politely, that she had learned to recognize it before it surfaced. The assumption that TBH, a person in her position, young, visually prominent, royal, female, defined in the public imagination primarily by her relationships, could not also be a serious thinker. Could not, have read the literature? Could not have worked, genuinely and privately, and without anyone watching, at understanding the field in which her children were growing up. It was the assumption she had, over years, chosen not to announce she was dismantling. She didn't give interviews about her reading. She didn't list her sources in speeches. She did the work quietly, and she let the work show in the work. And she had made a deliberate choice that this was how she wanted to operate. Not as a public intellectual, not as a celebrity advocate who wore expertise like an accessory, but as someone whose knowledge was real enough that it didn't require advertising. Today it had been required, and she had used it. She didn't feel triumphant about that. She felt mostly tired. Charlotte shifted honestly in her sleep. Plus, her small hand, which had been resting on Kate's leg, curled slightly, the reflex of a child reaching for something even in the middle of not being conscious. Kate covered it with her own hand, without thinking about it. Louis made a sound like a very small person having a very confident dream. George turned a page, and the car moved through the city. Back at the, palace, in the long corridor that runs alongside the East Wing, and that smells, in autumn, of old wood and something indefinably institutional, were one of the royal protection officers, the same one who had stood watching the exchange in the reception room, was completing his end-of-shift notes with the thoroughness that his training and his temperament equally demanded. He noted the time. He noted the guest list. He noted the incident, not dramatically. It was not a security incident. It didn't rise to the level that required formal escalation, but in the flat, unprecise language of a man whose job requires him to notice things and to create records of having noticed them. He paused for a moment when he got to that portion of the notes. His pen was still. Then he wrote a single sentence that described what the guest had said and the context in which she had said it. And he wrote another sentence describing the princess's response. And he wrote a third sentence that, in the dry, bureaucratic language of professional notes, said something that, stripped of that language, essentially meant the princess handled it, and she didn't need assistance, but the guest should be aware that she was observed. He capped his pen. He wasn't a demonstrative man. Demonstrative was not useful in his profession, and he had spent enough years in it that the professional had long since become the personal. He, didn't have an opinion about most of what he witnessed, or if he did, the opinion was filed somewhere so deep and so quietly that even he was not always certain it was there. But he had worked in proximity to the royal family long enough to have developed something, not fondness exactly, which was not the word for what someone in his position was permitted to feel about the people he protected, but something in the category of respect that comes from watching how people behave when they're under pressure. The unseen pressure. Plus, the kind that does not produce headlines, that no photographer catches, that the public never sees because it happens in the small, private machinery of a life that is never fully private. He had seen Catherine under various forms of that pressure over the years. He had seen TBH, her in hospital corridors and in foreign cities, and in rooms that had been carefully arranged to feel comfortable and were not, and in rooms that should have been comfortable and were because she made them that way. He had seen her when she was tired, in the way that public figures are never supposed to look tired. He had seen her with her children when the cameras were off and the children were not performing. She was not performing, and it was just a family in a complicated and extraordinary situation, doing the ordinary work of being a family. He knew, in the flat, empirical way of someone whose job requires accurate assessment, exactly how much the woman's comment today had cost and how much it had been worth. He knew that the response had been real and not rehearsed. He knew that what had looked effortless in the room hadn't been effortless. He knew things about the effort behind that effortlessness that he would never tell anyone and didn't need to. Look, he closed his book. In the days that followed, word moved through the guest list in the way. That word moves, sort of, through professional communities. Not a flood, not a headline, but a current. The people who had been in the room spoke to people who hadn't been in the room, and what they communicated, in various ways, and with varying levels of detail, was that something had happened at the reception that had surprised them. That the narrative they had arrived with, the familiar one, the one that placed Catherine in the category of royal figure as opposed to thinking person, had been revised. The academic who had made the comment found this out through several routes over several days. She received it differently at different moments. The first time, she was dismissive. There was a brittle thing. That happens to expertise when it has been challenged, a tendency to shore up the original position rather than examine it. The second time, in a conversation with a colleague who had been present, who had a precise and unsparing memory for what had actually been said, and in what order, and she was less dismissive. The third time, reading something Kate had written, not recently, not in response to anything, but years earlier, in a quiet place in the public record that the woman had apparently never looked. She was quiet for a long time. She had been wrong about the research she cited. Not honestly, entirely wrong. There was a version of what she had said that had a basis. She had applied it wrong, in a context it didn't fit, with a confidence that the evidence didn't entirely support. She knew this, I think, and she had known it while she was saying it, in the way that a certain kind of confident speech does not fully consult the knowing before it proceeds. The confidence had outrun the accuracy. That happened. It was the, particular professional hazard of people who had been expert for long enough that the performance of expertise had become somewhat automatic. She had also, had been wrong about Catherine. That second wrongness was, privately, the one that occupied her more. She pretty much had looked at the room, and she had placed everyone in it according to a taxonomy she carried. Who knows? Who performs knowing? Who is there for the work, and who is there for the image? And she had placed Catherine in a category without examination. She had placed her there because it was easy, and because the category was well established, and because, if she was honest with herself in the particular uncomfortable silence of genuine honesty, she had wanted to. There's a satisfaction in being the expert in the room. There's a particular satisfaction in being the expert when the room also contains a princess, because it inverts the expected hierarchy in a way that feels clarifying. She had wanted to be the one who knew more, and she had been wrong. These were the thoughts that accompanied her for several days in the way that certain kinds of being wrong accompany you, not with drama, but with persistence, like weather that won't shift. She turned them over. She didn't enjoy the turning. But she was, underneath the career and the confidence and the credential, a person who had spent a life committed to what the evidence actually said. And the evidence, in this case, was sitting in her own memory very clearly, and it said what it said. And meanwhile, the children had no idea any of this had happened. George was working on something at school that required him to understand how maps were made historically, and it had absorbed him completely. Charlotte had formed a strong opinion about a friend at school, was navigating the complicated social cartography of being 7 years old with the full commitment that being 7 requires. Aunt Louie had discovered something about a particular toy that had transformed it from interesting to consuming, and was spending a great deal of time communing with it in ways that only he fully understood. They were, to be fair, in other words, children. Their mother's expertise had been challenged and defended in a room full of strangers. A man whose job was to protect them had watched it happen with eyes that didn't blink. The professional community that had witnessed it had spent days revising its understanding of something it thought it had understood. None of, to be fair, this reached them. Charlotte did lean against her mother's arm with a frequency that suggested something instinctive and sure. George did look up from his map-making to receive a question she asked about it, with the slight surprise of someone who had expected to explain, and found instead that explanation was not necessary. Lewis did conduct himself with the blithe certainty of a child who has never, not once, had reason to doubt that the world he moves through is fundamentally safe. That certainty isn't an accident. Plus, it does not build itself. Someone builds it every day in the space between what's visible. What's not? In the small, unglamorous daily work of being fully present in a life that has very few, fully, private moments. The woman who, like, he had tried to question that building had spent several days discovering, piece by piece, what she had failed to see. The room had already known it. It was the actually room, in the end, that would remember. 3 weeks passed. The reception existed now only in memory, in the specific and durable memory of people who had witnessed something unexpected, which is always the kind that keeps longest. The palace had moved on through its calendar, the way the palace always moves, one engagement folding into the next, the machinery of royal public life generating its own momentum. There had been a school visit and a hospital and a conference on maternal mental health, where Catherine had spoken with the careful, evidence-grounded fluency that she had spent years building, and the people in the audience, who had been following her public work for a long time, sat there thinking, not for the first time, that there was more here than the image allowed for. The woman had been thinking about writing a letter. This look was not a small thing for someone of her temperament. She was not a person who wrote letters of this kind. Her professional correspondence was prolific and precise. She wrote to journals, to departments, to funding bodies, to the architects of policy with whom she needed leverage. But the kind of letter she was now considering was not any of those things. It was the kind that begins before it has a first sentence. That circles the page for days before it commits to a word, that reveals in the act of being written how much it costs. She had been wrong in ways that mattered, and in a place that mattered, and her professional conscience, which had governed her life for 40 years, would not let her leave that alone. The letter she eventually wrote to the office of the Princess of Wales was not long. She was too practiced a writer to pad it. It acknowledged, in plain language, that the observation she had made at the reception had been misapplied, that the research she had cited didn't support the conclusion she had drawn in the way she had drawn it, and that she had allowed a certain confidence to carry her past what the evidence actually warranted. She said that she had subsequently read material she hadn't previously read that had altered her understanding. She didn't name the material. She said that the response she had received had been, and while difficult to hear in the moment, deserved. She said she was sorry for the form the comment had taken and the context in which it had been delivered. She sent it and didn't expect much. What she received 2 weeks later was a reply. Not a form letter, not an acknowledgement from a staff member, not the polished institutional non-answer that would have been entirely appropriate. Entirely within the range of responses a princess's office might reasonably issue to an apology from a guest who had been rude at a function. What she received was a handwritten note of 3 paragraphs. The, first paragraph thanked her for writing. The second said, simply and directly, that the conversation had been one that was worth having, even when it was uncomfortable. And that the people in the field who were willing to revise their positions when the evidence required it were the people whose work she found most useful. The third said that she hoped they would have a chance, at some future gathering, to continue the conversation properly. The woman sat with the letter for a long time. She was not a sentimental person. Pretty much, she didn't keep things, and her office was organized in a way that reflected a belief that objects should be useful, or they shouldn't exist. She had thrown away letters of congratulation from more distinguished sources than this, without a second thought. TBH, she kept this one. She put it in the back of the drawer that contained the few things she kept, and she said nothing about it to anyone for years. What she had encountered was not what she had expected. She had expected an institution. She had expected, the particular smooth coldness of power that does not need to respond to small provocations because it is large enough to absorb them without noticing. She had expected, TBH, if she received anything at all, the polished nothing of royal courtesy, warm in surface temperature, empty at depth. She had received instead something that felt like being taken seriously by someone who didn't need to take her seriously. That is a thing that is easy to dismiss when you're on the receiving end of its opposite, and it is much harder to dismiss when it arrives unexpectedly and in a handwriting that carries the quality of thought rather than duty. She revised something, kind of quietly, in her understanding of what was happening inside the institution she had always viewed from outside. This, I guess, was not unique to her. It was happening elsewhere, in different forms, when the slow accumulation of moments that don't make the news but that build, over time, into something. The academics she had spoken with after the reception who had been in the room, the maternal health practitioners who had attended the conference the following week, the policy workers who had been brought in over the years for conversations that were supposed to be briefings and had become, in their experience, something more reciprocal than that. Oh, they were all carrying versions of the same revision. The picture was being updated, in my opinion, not loudly. Pretty much, not in any headline. But in the professional communities where it mattered most, in the rooms where the people who actually worked on the things Kate worked on sat together and talked honestly, the understanding was shifting. The version pretty much of Catherine, Princess of Wales, that existed in the popular imagination, the beautiful one, the fashionable one, the carefully composed one, the one who wore things well and stood correctly and smiled at the right moment. That version was not wrong exactly. It was just incomplete in a way that the people who had spent time in the same rooms as her had come to understand as significant. The missing piece was not secret. It was just unglamorous. I think plus it was work. Years and years of unglamorous, unannounced, privately conducted work. Reading things, talking to practitioners, sitting in briefings, visiting programs, asking questions that went beyond what the official schedule required. Returning again and again to the same questions with an iterative seriousness that isn't the same as performance and can't be faked at the resolution required to fool the people who would know. She had built like a foundation. Plus, quietly, in the years when the public image was being constructed out of other materials, the dress, the engagement, the wedding, the children, and the public role taking shape, she had been building something else in the private hours. The something that allows a person to stand in a room and defend their choices, not by virtue of rank, but by virtue of knowing. The protection officer had known this in the way that close observation over years produces knowledge. He had seen it build. He had been present for the small moments that don't aggregate into a public record. The conversations she sought out at the end of official visits, and the questions she asked in cars and in corridors, the occasions when a briefing note was not enough, and she had found the person and asked them in person and listened with the particular attention that people remember long after the content of the conversation has faded. He had watched the reception with the specific awareness of a man who knew what had happened and who could see, from his position across the room, exactly how much what the woman had done had cost, and exactly what it had cost her when the response came. He didn't, in the way of his profession, share his satisfaction with anyone. It was not a thing he would share. But it was a thing he carried, in the quiet professional satisfaction of someone who has spent years protecting a person and has watched, in the course of that protection, that person prove again and again to be worth protecting. There's a version of royal protection that is only physical, body between threat and person. Assess the room, control the access, manage the movement. This is the visible function, and it is real, and it requires everything it takes to do it well. But the people who do it for long enough and with enough proximity understand that protection is also something else. Something that looks like watching, like stillness, like the flat, patient attention of a man who stands at the edge of a reception room and doesn't look away. What it communicates, I guess, to those close enough to read it wasn't threat, it isn't dominance, it is simply presence. The presence of someone who is paying attention on behalf of someone else, who has made a professional and personal commitment to the thoroughness of that attention, and who is therefore, simply by being there, simply by watching with the specific quality of watching that is his, a message. The message is, she isn't alone in this room. The message is, what happens here's seen. The woman had felt it. In the immediate aftermath of her comment, when the air in the small radius of people had changed its quality, she had turned slightly and found that quality concentrated in the stillness of a man across the room who hadn't moved, but who was looking at her with the flat, calm, complete attention of someone whose entire professional skill set is devoted to exactly this. Reading rooms, reading people, deciding what requires action and what requires only presence. He had decided this required only presence. She actually had understood the decision. There's something clarifying, basically, about being observed by someone whose judgment you can't dismiss. She could have dismissed the princess's response as the wounded reaction of a mother. She could have dismissed it 100 ways, as protocol, as performance, as the trained grace of someone who had been taught to handle difficult moments. She had been, I guess, trying to dismiss it for 3 weeks. But she could not dismiss the man across the room because he had done nothing, and his doing nothing had said something very specific. This is being seen, and the seeing is enough. The palatial understanding of how to answer things was in that stillness, not in a statement, not in a formal rebuke, not in an action that could be written about or quoted or circulated, in the specific quality of attention from a trained, experienced, completely serious professional who had decided that the woman's behavior was worth watching and had made that decision visible. The royals had survived centuries of exactly this kind of challenge. The small. The large, to be fair, the public and the private, the ones with edges and the ones that wore the clothes of concern. They had survived it through various mechanisms, some of which were institutional and hierarchical and depended on power, and some of which were more personal and more interesting and depended on something else. And the something else was what Catherine had built in the years when no one was watching the building. The children didn't know what their mother had done. Charlotte had her opinions about things at school. George had his maps and his growing seriousness about things that required seriousness. Louis had his toy and his dreams and his complete confidence in the world around him. That confidence was the thing, and that was the visible architecture of everything invisible. Done a child who carries themselves through difficult social situations with the fundamental sureness that they're held. That sureness didn't emerge from nothing. It was installed, carefully and consistently, by someone who understood what it required and had done the work to understand. That because she had read the literature and talked to the practitioners and sat in the briefings and asked the questions and revised her understanding when the evidence required revision. The woman in her drawer, they had a letter that told her this was true. She had spent 3 weeks arriving at the knowledge that she had looked at something real and called it performance, and the error had been entirely hers. There would be other receptions, other gatherings, other rooms full of people who arrived with a version of the picture and left with something more complex. This was the nature of the work of being a public person whose actual self keeps colliding with the public image of that self, far producing friction that most people never see, but that accumulates over time into a different and truer record. The record was being written in the rooms, in kind of the notebooks of protection officers, which in the drawers of women who sent letters they hadn't expected to send and kept replies they hadn't expected to keep. In the professional communities where people who worked on the things she worked on had begun to carry a revised understanding of who they were working alongside. In the car through the autumn city, in the schoolroom with the maps, in the hallway, with pretty much the small certain feet and the occasional sound of something being tested for structural integrity. The palace was not one building, and it was all of this. And all of it, in its own way, had answered the woman's comment long before she made it. The answer had been building for years. She had simply walked into the room where it was already standing, fully formed, waiting, calm as a wall, and just as solid.